King Louis XIV wasn't just a king, he was the Sun King, the man who claimed God himself had chosen him to rule France. He built the most magnificent palace the world had ever seen at Versailles, with golden halls and crystal mirrors that stretched for miles. Nobles from across Europe came to bow before his throne, desperate for just a moment of his attention. He controlled everything, what people wore, how they spoke, even when they could sit down. But behind all that glittering power, beneath the silk and velvet, was a man so terrified of water that he almost never bathed. His breath could clear a room, his teeth rotted out of his skull, and the palace that symbolized divine perfection, it reeked like an open sewer. In this video, we'll reveal 5 disgusting hygiene practices that defined the Sun King's reign. The last one will shock you completely. Picture the grandest ballroom you've ever seen. Crystal chandeliers hang from a painted ceiling that depicts angels and gods dancing among clouds. Mirrors stretch from floor to ceiling, creating infinite reflections of splendor. Ladies in silk gowns worth more than houses glide across polished marble floors. Gentlemen in velvet coats bow and gesture with practiced elegance. Now picture those same elegant courtiers hiking up their expensive gowns and relieving themselves in the corners of that ballroom. This is daily life at Versailles. The palace houses 20,000 people during major court events, but it was built with only a handful of primitive latrines. Most of these are nothing more than holes in wooden seats positioned over pits that are supposed to be emptied regularly. But with thousands of people creating waste every day, the system collapses almost immediately. Courtiers, desperate for relief, discover creative solutions. Stairwells become impromptu toilets. Garden alcoves serve as private bathrooms. The space behind the grand tapestries in the Hall of Mirrors becomes a popular spot for quick relief during long ceremonies. The Duchess of Orleans, the king's sister-in-law, writes in her letters about stepping over human excrement while walking through what are supposed to be the most civilized halls in Europe. She describes the stench as so overwhelming that ladies carry small bouquets of flowers, called nosegays, not for decoration but pressed against their noses to mask the smell of human waste. Chamber pots become the luxury solution for those wealthy enough to afford them. But even these create problems. Servants empty them by simply dumping the contents out of windows into the courtyards below. Visitors learn quickly to walk close to buildings to avoid being doused with waste falling from upper floors. The most shocking part isn't the mess, it's the acceptance. Courtiers step delicately around piles of excrement while discussing philosophy and art. They conduct business negotiations while breathing through perfumed handkerchiefs. They attend church services in chapels that reek of human waste, praying to a god they believe has ordained their king's divine right to rule. The Sun King himself seems oblivious to the crisis his housing policies have created. When courtiers delicately suggest that perhaps more facilities might be constructed, he dismisses their concerns. After all, he has his own private arrangements. The problems of common courtiers, even if those common courtiers are dukes and duchesses, are beneath his notice. Foreign ambassadors visiting Versailles return to their home countries with stories that seem too outrageous to believe. The Venetian ambassador writes that the palace gleams like heaven and stinks like hell. The English ambassador requests meetings be held in gardens, claiming the indoor air is unbreathable. But the courtiers stay. They endure the stench, the humiliation, the degradation, because proximity to the Sun King means power. They'll step over excrement for the chance to hand him his shirt in the morning or hold his candle at night. The public toilet crisis at Versailles becomes a perfect metaphor for absolute monarchy, beautiful on the surface, rotten underneath, and sustained by people willing to ignore obvious problems rather than challenge royal authority. The year is 1682. A silver bathtub, decorated with images of Roman gods and filled with warm water scented with rose petals, sits in the Sun King's private chambers. Steam rises gently from the surface. Servants stand ready with soft linens and aromatic oils. Louis XIV approaches the tub, studies it for a moment, then turns away in disgust. "Remove it," he commands. "Water is the enemy of health." This scene repeats itself throughout his reign. The Sun King, who bathes in adoration and luxury, refuses to bathe in water. His physicians support this decision, citing medieval medical theories that remain popular in the 17th century. They argue that water opens the skin's pores, allowing disease-carrying air to enter the body. They claim that the natural oils produced by unwashed skin create a protective barrier against illness. But Louis XIV takes these theories to an extreme that horrifies even his own doctors. Historical records suggest that Louis XIV took only 2 full baths in his entire adult life. The first was prescribed by physicians to treat a particularly severe skin condition that covered his body in painful sores. The second occurred just before his wedding to Marie-Thérèse of Austria, when court officials insisted that diplomatic protocol demanded cleanliness. Both experiences traumatized him. He emerged from each bath convinced that he felt weaker, more vulnerable to disease. He swore never to subject himself to such danger again. Instead, he develops an elaborate daily ritual designed to clean his body without using water. Servants change his linen shirts 3 times each day, believing that fresh fabric will absorb impurities from his skin. They rub his body with perfumed cloths, but these cloths must be completely dry. His morning routine becomes a carefully choreographed performance. 47 different courtiers have specific roles in dressing the king. The most privileged nobles compete for the honor of handing him his shirt or holding his mirror. But those closest to him learn to breathe through their mouths. The king's body odor becomes legendary throughout Europe. Visitors describe a smell so powerful that it seems to precede him into rooms. The Duchess of Saint-Simon writes that approaching the king requires considerable fortitude and the ability to control one's facial expressions. Perfume becomes Louis XIV's primary weapon against his own stench. He douses himself in scents made from musk, amber, and exotic flowers. But these perfumes, applied over unwashed skin, create a nauseating combination that makes the problem worse rather than better. The irony is that Louis XIV demands absolute cleanliness from everyone else at court. Courtiers must change their clothes multiple times daily. Servants must keep every surface in the palace spotless. The slightest speck of dirt on a mirror or window can result in punishment, but the king himself grows filthier by the day. His bathing phobia influences the entire court. Courtiers, desperate to imitate their monarch, begin avoiding water themselves. Bathing becomes associated with weakness and foreignness. The French court, once admired throughout Europe for its sophistication, becomes known for its overwhelming stench. Foreign ambassadors learn to conduct meetings quickly and in well-ventilated rooms. The Spanish ambassador requests that important discussions take place in gardens rather than enclosed spaces. The Pope's representative suggests that perhaps God would approve of cleanliness as a form of respect for the divine temple of the body. But Louis XIV remains unmoved. He has convinced himself that his unwashed state represents not just personal preference but royal prerogative. The Sun King doesn't need to follow the same rules as ordinary mortals. If he chooses to avoid water, then water avoidance becomes a sign of divine wisdom. The air at Versailles doesn't smell like a palace. It smells like a perfume factory exploded in a sewer. Clouds of musk, amber, rose, and jasmine hang so thick in the royal apartments that visitors' eyes water before they even see the king. What begins as an attempt to mask body odor evolves into something far more sinister, a chemical fog that threatens to poison everyone who breathes it. Louis XIV doesn't just wear perfume, he bathes in it. Servants spray it on his clothes, his furniture, his bedding. They burn perfumed candles and incense throughout his rooms. They scatter perfumed powders on floors and carpets. The goal is to create such an overwhelming cloud of artificial scent that no natural odor can penetrate it. But 17th century perfumes aren't the refined fragrances we know today. They're brutal chemical concoctions made from ingredients that would horrify modern users. Musk comes from the genital glands of male deer, creating a scent that's more animal than floral. Ambergris, a waxy substance found in whale intestines, provides a base note that some describe as oceanic and others describe as putrid. The most expensive perfumes contain mercury, lead, and other toxic metals that give them lasting power and shimmer. Court ladies apply these perfumes to their skin daily, unknowingly poisoning themselves in pursuit of fashionable scents. Many develop mysterious illnesses that physicians can't explain: headaches, tremors, hair loss, and skin conditions that mirror the symptoms of heavy metal poisoning. The Sun King's personal perfume is a closely guarded secret created by master perfumers who spend months blending exotic ingredients. Contemporary accounts describe it as powerful enough to announce his presence from 3 rooms away and capable of masking any earthly odor, no matter how strong. But masking isn't the same as eliminating. Underneath the chemical cloud, Louis XIV's unwashed body continues to decay. The perfume mixes with his natural scent to create something even more nauseating than either smell alone. Courtiers learn to recognize the approach of their king by this unique combination of artificial flowers and human rot. The perfume industry explodes around the royal court. Hundreds of merchants compete to supply scents to nobles desperate to copy their king's approach to hygiene. Entire forests are stripped of flowers and aromatic plants. Exotic animals are hunted to near extinction to supply musk and other animal-based scents. The economic impact is staggering. France spends more on perfume during Louis XIV's reign than on some military campaigns. The king's personal perfume budget exceeds the annual income of many small towns. Courtiers bankrupt themselves buying scents they hope will mask their own unwashed bodies while demonstrating their loyalty to royal fashion. But the chemical assault creates unexpected problems. Servants working in the royal apartments develop respiratory problems from constantly breathing perfumed air. Some collapse during long ceremonies in poorly ventilated rooms where perfume fumes concentrate to dangerous levels. The palace's ventilation systems, designed for normal air circulation, can't cope with the toxic fog that pervades royal spaces. Windows must remain open even in winter to prevent the chemical buildup from becoming lethal. Foreign visitors learn to limit their time in the king's presence to avoid perfume poisoning. Medical records from the period describe mysterious ailments that affect people who spend time at court. Symptoms include severe headaches, nausea, difficulty breathing, and skin rashes. Modern analysis suggests these were likely caused by prolonged exposure to the toxic chemicals used in period perfumes. The Sun King seems immune to these effects, perhaps because his body has adapted to constant chemical exposure. Or perhaps his symptoms are attributed to other causes by physicians who wouldn't dare suggest that their king's personal habits might be harmful. What begins as an attempt to solve a hygiene problem becomes a public health crisis that affects thousands of people. The air at Versailles becomes so contaminated with perfume chemicals that some areas of the palace are barely habitable. The Sun King's smile is a horror show. By age 40, Louis XIV has lost most of his teeth. The few remaining stumps are black with decay, causing constant pain and making eating a torture. His breath is so foul that courtiers learn to stand at specific angles during conversations to avoid the full force of his exhalations. But the worst is yet to come. In 1685, the royal dentist, a man named Felix, decides that the king's remaining upper teeth must be extracted to prevent the spread of infection. The procedure, performed without anesthesia in an age before proper surgical technique, goes catastrophically wrong. Felix uses crude iron tools to pry out the rotted teeth. He pulls too hard, breaks the jaw, and accidentally removes part of the king's upper palate. The result is a gaping hole that connects the mouth to the nasal cavity, allowing food and drink to pour out of the Sun King's nose when he tries to eat or drink. The pain is indescribable. The king screams during meals as acidic foods burn the exposed tissue. Liquids spray from his nostrils when he attempts to speak. The hole in his palate refuses to heal, creating a permanent wound that becomes infected repeatedly. Court meals become exercises in horror and embarrassment. The Sun King, who insists on eating in public as part of royal ceremony, struggles to consume even soft foods. Soup dribbles from his nose. Wine sprays across the table when he tries to drink. Courtiers, forbidden to show any reaction to their monarch's condition, must pretend not to notice as their divine ruler's dinner cascades from his nostrils. The king's speech becomes increasingly difficult to understand. The hole in his palate changes the way air flows through his mouth, creating a nasal quality that makes his words sound like he's speaking through liquid. Important diplomatic negotiations must be repeated multiple times, as foreign ambassadors struggle to comprehend what their host is saying. But Louis XIV's vanity won't allow him to acknowledge the problem. He continues to hold public audiences, speak at length during court ceremonies, and maintain the fiction that he is the perfect embodiment of divine majesty. Courtiers must strain to understand his garbled pronunciations while maintaining expressions of rapt attention. The dental catastrophe affects more than just eating and speaking. The constant infection in his mouth spreads throughout his body, causing fevers, headaches, and general illness that physicians can't effectively treat. The smell of infected tissue adds a new dimension to his already overwhelming body odor. Palace servants responsible for cleaning the king's dining area face a daily nightmare. Food mixed with blood and pus must be scrubbed from chairs, tables, and floors. The stench of infected saliva permeates fabrics and furniture, Rooms where the king has eaten must be aired out for hours before they can be used again. The psychological impact on Louis XIV is profound. The man who believes himself to be God's representative on earth, whose physical presence is supposed to inspire awe and reverence, can barely eat or speak without creating a disgusting spectacle. Yet his absolute power means that no one can suggest solutions or even acknowledge that a problem exists. Portraits from this period show the king with his mouth carefully closed, hiding the devastation behind his lips. His famous smile, once used to charm courtiers and intimidate rivals, disappears entirely from public appearances. The Sun King's face becomes a mask designed to conceal the rotting reality beneath. Foreign observers note the change in Louis XIV's demeanour. Once confident and commanding, he becomes defensive about his appearance and reluctant to speak at length. The dental nightmare affects his ability to rule effectively, as important discussions become exercises in miscommunication and embarrassment. The tragedy is that effective dental care existed during this period. Other European courts employed skilled dentists who could extract teeth safely and even create primitive but functional replacements. But Louis XIV's fear of appearing weak or imperfect prevents him from seeking proper treatment until it's too late. The final and most shocking truth about Versailles is that the palace doesn't just ignore human waste, it turns it into a business opportunity. With 20,000 residents producing waste daily and only a handful of facilities to handle it, creative solutions become economic necessities. The palace administration develops a system that's both ingenious and revolting. They sell human excrement. Night soil men, workers who empty chamber pots and clean latrines, don't simply dispose of the waste they collect. They load it onto carts and sell it to farmers throughout the surrounding countryside as fertilizer. The waste of nobles, they claim, is particularly valuable because of their rich diets and expensive medications. The business becomes surprisingly profitable. Farmers pay premium prices for noble soil, believing that waste from the upper classes contains better nutrients than common sewage. The night soil men, once considered the lowest social class, begin earning respectable incomes from their disgusting trade. But this economic system creates a public health catastrophe that spreads far beyond Versailles. Human waste, unlike animal manure, carries diseases that can survive in soil for months. When farmers spread untreated sewage from the palace on their fields, they contaminate the food supply for hundreds of miles around Paris. Dysentery, typhus, cholera, and other waterborne diseases begin appearing in communities that have never experienced such problems. The contamination spreads through multiple pathways. Crops grown in infected soil carry disease to markets throughout northern France. Wells and streams become contaminated when rain washes infected soil into water supplies. Even the air becomes dangerous, as dried waste particles blow across the countryside during windy weather. Villages that once enjoyed relative health suddenly face epidemic diseases. Mortality rates spike in farming communities around Versailles as previously unknown illnesses sweep through the population. The palace's waste management system becomes a weapon of mass destruction deployed against the French peasantry. But the economic incentives are too strong to resist. The palace administration, desperate to manage its waste problem as cheaply as possible, continues selling to farmers who believe they're purchasing valuable fertilizer. The night soil men, enjoying unprecedented prosperity, have no incentive to reveal the health consequences of their trade. Medical knowledge of the time doesn't connect disease transmission with waste contamination. Physicians blame outbreaks on bad air or divine punishment rather than identifying the real source. The connection between palace waste and rural disease remains hidden for decades. Inside Versailles, the waste economy creates its own problems. Areas designated for waste collection become breeding grounds for rats, flies, and other disease vectors. The smell of fermenting human excrement competes with perfume for dominance in palace air. Servants working in waste management develop chronic illnesses that no one can explain. The system also creates a grotesque social hierarchy within the palace staff. Night soil men, despite their necessary function, are considered so contaminated that they are forbidden from approaching royal apartments without extensive cleaning rituals. Yet their income from waste sales sometimes exceeds that of more prestigious servants. Foreign visitors, horrified by what they observe, carry stories of Versailles' waste economy back to their home countries. The French court, once admired throughout Europe for its sophistication, becomes known for turning human excrement into profit while poisoning its own population. The most chilling aspect of this system is its longevity. The waste economy operates throughout Louis XIV's reign and beyond, creating generations of contamination and disease. Entire regions of France become known for mysterious illnesses that seem to strike randomly but actually follow the distribution patterns of palace waste. When modern historians calculate the human cost of Louis XIV's reign, they focus on wars, taxes, and political oppression. But the hidden casualties, XIV, the thousands of peasants who died from diseases spread through contaminated waste, may represent the greatest crime of the Sun King's rule. The palace that claims to represent divine civilization becomes the source of pestilence that spreads across the French countryside like a plague dispatched by an angry god. By 1710, the Sun King's body is failing as spectacularly as his hygiene practices. Louis XIV, now 72 years old, can barely eat solid food. The hole in his palate has never healed, causing constant pain and infection. His remaining teeth have rotted to black stumps. Sores and rashes cover his unwashed skin, hidden beneath layers of makeup and powder that can no longer mask the smell of decay. His legs are covered in festering ulcers that refuse to heal. The royal physicians, still forbidden from suggesting that bathing might help, prescribe increasingly desperate treatments. They apply heated pokers to burn out infected tissue. They drain pus from swollen areas using primitive surgical tools. They feed him mercury-based medicines that poison him further while claiming to purify his blood. The stench emanating from the king's body becomes so overwhelming that courtiers struggle to remain in his presence during official ceremonies. The perfume budget reaches astronomical levels as servants desperately try to create a breathable atmosphere around their deteriorating monarch. But Louis XIV refuses to acknowledge his physical decline. He continues to hold court, receive foreign ambassadors, and maintain the elaborate rituals that have defined his reign. The divine king cannot admit to mortal weakness, even as his body rots around him. In August 1715, the Sun King develops gangrene in his leg. The smell of dying tissue adds a new horror to his already overwhelming odor. Courtiers, taking their turn in the royal bedchamber, must press perfumed handkerchiefs to their faces to avoid vomiting. On the 1st of September, 1715, Louis XIV dies in his bed at Versailles. Within hours of his death, his body begins to decompose so rapidly that it shocks even the experienced palace staff. Contemporary accounts describe worms appearing in his corpse almost immediately, as if his body was so contaminated with infection that decay began before life fully departed. The funeral arrangements become a nightmare of logistics and hygiene. The king's body, despite multiple applications of preservative substances, continues to putrefy at an alarming rate. The smell becomes so unbearable that the funeral procession must be conducted at night with windows open to prevent mourners from collapsing. Even in death, Louis XIV's hygiene practices create problems for everyone around him. The legacy of the Sun King's reign extends far beyond his personal decomposition. The hygiene practices he established at Versailles influence European aristocracy for generations. Courts throughout the continent adopt French customs, including the dangerous avoidance of bathing and the excessive use of toxic perfumes. The waste management system he ignored continues to poison French farmland for decades after his death. The diseases spread by contaminated palace sewage become endemic in rural communities, creating health problems that persist well into the 18th century. But perhaps most tragically, the Sun King's example demonstrates how absolute power can corrupt not just politically but physically. When no one has the authority to tell a ruler that his practices are harmful, those practices can become literally toxic to everyone around him. Louis XIV created a system where appearance mattered more than reality, where royal vanity took precedence over public health, where the fiction of divine perfection was maintained even as the divine body rotted from within. The Sun King taught Europe that power could shine like gold while decaying from the inside. Versailles dazzled the world with its magnificence, but its filth revealed the truth about absolute monarchy, beautiful surfaces hiding corruption, wealth masking poverty, and divine authority, built on foundations of human waste. The man who claimed that he was the state left behind a legacy written in excrement and decay. His reign demonstrated that even kings are subject to the consequences of willful ignorance, and that no amount of gold can cover the stench of institutional rot. When we remember Louis XIV today, we see the glittering palace, the magnificent art, the military victories, and the cultural achievements. But underneath all that glory lies a simpler truth. The Sun King was a man so afraid of clean water that he chose to live and die in his own filth, taking thousands of his subjects down with him. The divine right of kings, it turns out, doesn't include the right to ignore basic hygiene, but it does include the power to make everyone else suffer the consequences.